Greetings, comrades. Welcome to the new episode of Deep Dive to Marxism podcast series, which we explore the Marxist perspective on philosophy, science, and society through the lens of dialectical materialism. It's really great to have you with us in this episode again.
It really is. We have a fantastic and honestly pretty intense discussion lined up for today.
We absolutely do. So today we are diving into a massive stack of sources, articles, essays, theoretical statements, all pulled from a publication called In Defense of Marxism.
Right, which is the theoretical organ of the Revolutionary Communist International.
Exactly. And our mission today is to really unpack how this specific Marxist framework interprets the modern environmental crisis.
Yeah, and it's a perspective that completely upends the usual mainstream narrative, you know? It replaces all that stuff about personal responsibility with a pretty ruthless economic calculus.
It really does. But hey, before we get too deep into the weeds, I just want to set some ground rules for how we're approaching this.
Always a good idea.
Yeah, so we are your guides today. We are exploring these arguments to understand them, not necessarily endorsing them or campaigning for a revolution ourselves.
Right. We're looking objectively at how this theory operates.
Exactly. Whether you're a staunch conservative or a moderate liberal, understanding different philosophical frameworks, especially radical ones, it's the only way to genuinely sharpen your own critical thinking.
For sure. And the foundational logic of these texts is that climate change is not just a scientific problem.
Right.
It's a systemic terminal symptom of an economic design, a design that requires infinite growth on a planet with finite resources.
So let's start right there with that tension between systemic issues and individual action. Because, I mean, if you grew up in the last 30 years, the messaging has been hyper-individualized, hasn't it?
Oh, totally. Buy a reusable coffee cup, sort your recycling.
Yeah, take shorter showers, maybe buy a Tesla if you can afford it.
Right. But these sources, they look at the whole concept of a personal carbon footprint and they completely dismiss it.
They savage it.
Yeah, they really do. They don't just see it as ineffective. They view it as a deliberate ideological distraction.
And to understand why, for any comrades who might be new to this terminology, we need to define a core Marxist concept, the means of production.
Exactly. It's a term that comes up in literally every single article we read for this.
So when these authors talk about the means of production, they mean the massive physical infrastructure of human society.
Right. The energy grids.
The continent-spanning agricultural monopolies.
The shipping fleets, the automated mega factories, the things that actually make the world run.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the central Marxist premise is that the ownership of these colossal mechanisms is concentrated in the hands of a microscopic fraction of the global population.
The capitalist class.
Right. And here is the critical mechanism. The people who own these means of production, they don't operate them to create ecological harmony.
No, of course not.
And they don't operate them to maximize human well-being either. By the very mathematical laws of the market, they have to operate them to maximize profit.
Yeah, they have to continually expand their capital. If they don't, they get outcompeted and destroyed by rival capitalists. It's systemic.
So if I'm following the logic of the text, because this tiny minority dictates exactly how energy is generated and how raw materials are extracted, they are inherently responsible for the vast majority of global pollution.
Yes, exactly. The text basically says it's an asymmetrical absurdity.
An asymmetrical absurdity. I like that phrasing.
Right, because you're asking a working class individual to solve a planetary crisis that was created by the industrial output of a multinational conglomerate.
Yeah, your canvas grocery bag does not alter the fact that, a handful of fossil fuel companies are responsible for the majority of global emissions since the industrial age.
It really forces a psychological shift, you know?
How so?
Well, think about climate anxiety. How many times have you or anyone listening felt this pang of guilt because you bought something wrapped in single-use plastic?
Because it was the only one you could afford at the store.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. These authors are essentially taking that heavy burden of personal guilt, lifting it entirely off the shoulders of the individual consumer, and weaponizing it into political anger against global monopolies.
It moves the entire conversation from personal moral failing to structural class conflict.
Precisely. You aren't failing the earth by driving a gas-powered car to your job. The system is failing the earth by aggressively lobbying against public transit so that the gas car is your only economically viable option to survive.
You know, while I was reading this section, I kept thinking of this analogy.
Oh, let's hear it.
It's like we're all in this massive ocean liner.
Right.
And the ship has struck a reef and is taking on water.
Okay, sinking ship. Got it.
And the mainstream environmental movement is running up and down the hallways, handing every passenger a tiny teaspoon.
Right, telling everyone to bail water.
Yeah, do your part, bail faster, we're all in this together.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, down in the bowels of the ship, the owners of the vessel are actively using blowtorches to cut massive holes in the hull.
Because they want to sell the scrap metal to passing submarines for a record-breaking quarterly profit.
Exactly.
That captures the economic mechanism perfectly. The ship sinking isn't an accident. Tearing apart the hull is their core business model.
And as long as the people holding the blowtorches own the ship, your teaspoon is mathematically irrelevant.
Exactly.
But okay, let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
A lot of people would point to the power of the consumer, right? The authors dismiss individual action, but what about collective consumer action? Mass boycotts.
Right, where people refuse to buy a product.
Yeah. We've seen coordinated boycotts force multi-billion-dollar corporations to change. They abandon toxic chemicals or change supply chains because of public pressure. So how do these Marxist authors justify claiming that only the total seizure of assets works?
That's a great question. And the authors would argue that you're confusing a cosmetic change with a structural one.
Cosmetic versus structural. Break that down for me.
Let's look at the mechanism. Say a massive boycott forces a food conglomerate to stop using plastic packaging, and they switch to a biodegradable paper alternative.
Mainstream environmentalists would celebrate that as a huge victory.
You would. And objectively, yes, it reduces plastic waste. But the Marxist critique is that the fundamental nature of the exploitation hasn't changed by a single millimeter.
Because they're still extracting resources.
Right. They are still exploiting labor in the global south to harvest the materials for that new paper packaging. They are still prioritizing the profit margin above all else.
So under capitalism, environmental destruction isn't truly stopped by consumer pressure.
No, it's just outsourced.
Yeah.
Or geographically relocated or, cleverly rebranded.
No.
The text is unambiguous here. True sustainability is impossible as long as production is dictated by private profit. Their explicit demand is that the working class must seize the wealth and infrastructure of these conglomerates.
And place them under democratic management.
Exactly, meaning the people actually doing the work, the factory workers, the logistics drivers, the engineers, they collectively decide what is produced and how it impacts their own communities.
Rather than a board of directors maximizing shareholder value. Okay, so that establishes the theoretical bedrock. It's not about your carbon footprint, it's about who owns the factories.
Right.
But what makes these sources so compelling is that they don't just leave this as an abstract academic exercise. They drag this framework directly into the mud and floodwaters of recent global disasters.
They aggressively map this theory onto extreme weather events, and this brings us to a really grueling catalog of crises detailed in the texts.
Yeah, the sources pull no punches here.
No, they don't. They dissect specific events to prove their thesis. The 2018 global heat waves, for example.
Right, which killed 91 people in Greece.
Left 77 dead and over 30,000 hospitalized in Japan. Killed 54 people in Quebec.
And then they look at the November 2019 floods in Venice.
The freak weather in Pakistan in 2020. The incredibly severe, deadly floods in Germany in July 2021.
Now, when a disaster of that magnitude strikes, the standard media narrative usually follows a very predictable script, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The meteorologists show the satellite footage, the politicians express their condolences.
And the consensus is just. Climate change is making weather extreme. This is a terrible, unavoidable tragedy.
Right. But authors like Ben Curry and Alexander Kalabakau completely reject that framing.
They look at a flooded city and almost bypass the weather entirely.
Yeah, they blame the death tolls on a very specific economic policy. Austerity.
Okay, we need to clearly define what austerity actually means in practice for anyone learning this history for the first time, because it is crucial.
Definitely. Austerity is not just a generic word for times being tough. It's a deliberate political and economic strategy.
Right. When a capitalist state faces an economic crisis or a deficit, they choose austerity to balance the budget.
By drastically cutting public spending, it means defunding the fire departments, halting maintenance on aging dams and levees,
slashing budgets for emergency medical services and public housing.
Exactly. So when Kalabakau writes about the 2021 floods in Germany, he isn't just saying the rain was unprecedented. He's arguing the state fundamentally failed its citizens.
Because it spent decades gutting the exact infrastructure needed to keep them alive.
Right. The Marxist argument is that when a flood hits, the water is natural, but the disaster, who drowns in their basement, who loses their savings, how quickly rescue arrives, that is entirely dictated by class and economic policy.
I really want to zoom in on the Venice floods from November 2019 because the source material from the local Marxist group there, Sinistra Classe Rivoluzione, is incredibly revealing.
Oh, it's a perfect microcosm of their broader thesis.
They write about the havoc wreaked on the city, but their focus is entirely on the callousness of big business.
Right, because Venice has been sinking for a long time. The waters are rising. We know this scientifically.
And in response, there was this massive engineering initiative called the MoSea project, right, to build seawalls.
Yeah, sophisticated seawalls to protect the lagoon. But the authors highlight that this project was stalled for decades.
Stalled by what?
Mired in staggering levels of political corruption, bribery, financial mismanagement, billions of euros siphoned off by private contractors and politicians.
While the city remained entirely defenseless.
Exactly. And at the exact same time that the protective infrastructure was being looted, the text points out that the city was allowing massive, monolithic cruise ships to continue entering the lagoon.
Wait, really? During all of this?
Yep. And those cruise ships, by their sheer displacement, were actively eroding the delicate foundations of the city.
But the cruise ship industry generates massive profits.
Right. So you have a situation where the infrastructure designed to save citizens is stalled by capitalist corruption, while the industry accelerating the destruction is protected by the state because it makes money.
It just perfectly illustrates that when the profit motive conflicts with human safety, the profit motive wins.
Always, leading directly to catastrophe.
Think about how radically that reframes your understanding of the daily news. When you turn on your TV and see a reporter in waist-deep water after a hurricane, how does this Marxist perspective change what you are watching?
Well, according to these sources, if you're only listening to the wind speeds and barometric pressure, you're missing the actual story.
You're missing the defunded local emergency management agency.
You're missing the zoning boards that allowed luxury developers to pave over the natural wetlands that used to absorb storm surges.
You're missing the corporations that lobbied against building stronger infrastructure just to avoid a slightly higher tax rate.
It forces you to constantly ask, who built the infrastructure that failed? Who profited from cutting corners? And who is disproportionately suffering?
Right. The authors argue the media hyper-focuses on the extreme weather to obscure the deliberate failures of the capitalist state.
But if we follow that logic, it takes us somewhere even darker.
Yeah, because what happens when the destruction of the environment isn't an accident or a side effect?
What happens when it's an active, intentional, required business strategy?
Which brings us to Brazil in 2019, under the presidency of Jair Bolsonaro.
Yes. We have two very powerful analytical pieces here from Felipe Liborio and Lucy Dias. The lens shifts from passive mismanagement to aggressive state-sponsored destruction.
They are detailing the expansion of slash-and-burn agriculture in the Amazon. And again, let's explain the mechanics. Why burn the Amazon?
It's not cartoon villainy, it's economics.
Right. Global conglomerates need vast expanses of cleared land. They needed to raise cattle for beef and to plant endless monocultures of soy.
Much of which is used to feed livestock globally, yeah.
And to get that land cheaply and quickly, you literally set the rainforest on fire. You displace or murder the indigenous populations and poor peasantry living there.
It is the brutal reality of primitive accumulation happening in real time.
But what Lucy Dias focuses on is the socio-political chain reaction this triggers.
Right, because for a long time, the destruction of the Amazon felt abstract to the working class people in the massive urban centers of Brazil.
It was an issue for conservationists, not a daily survival issue for a factory worker in São Paulo.
But then the smoke arrived.
It's 3:00 p.m. on an August afternoon in São Paulo, one of the largest metropolises on Earth. And the sky hasn't just gotten cloudy, it has turned pitch black.
Literally blotted out by an apocalyptic volume of smoke drifting thousands of miles from the Amazon basin.
Such a dystopian concept. The exhaust from this agricultural capitalism becomes so immense that it literally blots out the sun.
And Dias points out that when the sky turned black, the environment instantly transformed from a distant abstraction into an immediate catalyst for mass political outrage.
Hey comrades, do you have any other idea or question about this subject? Please write in comments so we can discuss together. I really want to hear your thoughts on this because I have to ask you, based on your reading of the text, does a visual shock of that magnitude actually change the political landscape?
The sources argue emphatically that it does. It accelerates what Marxist theory calls class consciousness.
Which is the moment the working class recognizes they share a unified struggle against the capitalist class.
Exactly. Dias writes that the darkness over São Paulo fed the anger and resentment against the Bolsonaro government.
So capitalism basically creates the physical conditions for its own unmasking.
Yeah. When the pursuit of profit becomes so deranged that it physically chokes the largest city in the hemisphere, the contradictions of the system become impossible to ignore.
The environment stops being a niche issue and becomes a non-negotiable issue of daily survival.
Right. The smoke wasn't just pollution. It was corporate profit interfering with the ability of millions of people to breathe.
Hey, comrade. By the way, if you liked and interested in the topics in this episode so far, please don't forget to like, share, and comment. Also, it would be appreciated if you subscribe to the channel to be informed about new episodes. It's also really important for us to continue the series.
Absolutely. It really helps out.
So getting back to it, if I'm looking at this globally, governments and businesses obviously do respond to the crisis, right?
I mean, they claim to.
Yeah, we have international climate treaties. The UN holds massive summits. Governments pass carbon pricing. If the crisis is so obvious, why do these Marxist sources argue that these mainstream solutions are just elaborate illusions?
This is perhaps the most intellectually rigorous part of our deep dive, the Marxist critique of green capitalism.
Because they argue the state isn't a neutral arbiter trying to save the planet.
Exactly. The state is a manager of capitalist interests. And to prove this, the sources thoroughly dissect three specific policy events.
The 2008 British Columbia carbon tax, the 2015 2P21 Paris Agreement, and the 2021 Swiss CO2 bill referendum.
Let's start with the carbon tax in British Columbia, analyzed by Robert Faber.
Now, in a standard economics class, a carbon tax is presented as the gold standard. The logic seems flawless. Put a financial price on carbon pollution, the free market adjusts, emissions go down.
Right. It sounds elegant, but Faber absolutely dismantles it.
How so?
He looks past the theory and examines the actual flow of capital. The Marxist critique argues that a carbon tax under capitalism is not environmental protection. It is a regressive tax mechanism.
Okay, let's break down exactly how a regressive tax works here, just so everyone is on the same page.
A regressive tax is applied uniformly, meaning it takes a disproportionately larger percentage of income from low-income earners than from wealthy people.
Right.
So let's look at Faber's logic. The government levies a tax on carbon emissions from a massive agricultural conglomerate that produces bread.
Does the CEO of that company just absorb the tax and take a pay cut?
Of course not. Their mandate is to maintain profit margins. So they pass the entire cost of the carbon tax directly onto the consumer by raising the price of a loaf of bread.
So the billionaire executive and the single mother working a minimum wage factory job both end up paying the exact same 50-cent price increase for that bread.
Precisely. And 50 cents is mathematically insignificant to the billionaire, but it's a highly significant portion of the factory worker's daily wage.
And the working class generally has no alternative. They can't just immediately upgrade to an electric car or install solar panels.
No, they have to keep buying gas to drive to their jobs and heating oil to survive the winter, regardless of the tax.
And Faber argues the corporations use their lobbying power to secure loopholes and subsidies, right?
Exactly. Ensuring their profits remain untouched, while the working class bears the entire financial burden. Faber concludes it was overwhelmingly just another tool to transfer wealth upward.
That brings us to the international stage. The 2015 COP21 Paris Agreement, which Adam Booth tackles.
Oh, I remember the media coverage of this.
Wall-to-wall jubilation. World leaders holding hands, crying, declaring they had finally secured a historic landmark to save the world.
And Booth's analysis completely punctures that spectacle. He argues it was largely diplomatic theater.
Because the underlying engine global capitalism remained entirely untouched.
Right. Booth points out the fatal flaw in expecting competing capitalist nation-states to voluntarily reduce their economic output.
Because the agreements are voluntary.
Exactly. A nation-state primarily exists to protect its own national monopolies. If Germany enforces strict, expensive emission cuts on its steel industry, but China or the U.S. doesn't,
the German steel industry loses its competitive edge. They lose profit.
Therefore, Booth argues, because every nation is locked in a zero-sum competition for global market share, they will inevitably break or water down any agreement the exact moment it threatens domestic economic growth.
So relying on the Paris Agreement is like asking a group of rival predators to voluntarily agree to stop eating meat.
The system mathematically prohibits it.
Wow. But the most fascinating example of this dynamic is the 2021 Swiss CO2 bill referendum, covered by the Swiss Marxist group Der Funke.
Right, here is the setup. Switzerland puts a massive bill designed to reduce CO2 emissions to a direct public vote.
And the bill is defeated.
The dynamics of why it was defeated are incredibly revealing.
Because obviously you have the far-right parties and fossil fuel conglomerates pumping money in to defeat the bill to protect profits. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But the shock is that the Marxist groups in our sources also aggressively campaigned for a no vote. They actively fought to kill a massive piece of environmental legislation. Why?
This introduces a vital term, green austerity. Der Funke analyzed the actual economic mechanisms written into the Swiss bill.
And what did they find?
They saw the legislation relied heavily on regressive taxation, taxes on fuel, heating, fees that would dramatically increase the daily cost of living for the average Swiss worker.
Well, containing massive loopholes from major industrial polluters to avoid the financial pain.
Exactly. So it wasn't a rejection of environmentalism. It was a rejection of who was being forced to pay for it.
Der Funke argued that capitalist politicians were trying to make the working class foot the bill for a crisis created by fat cat polluters.
Right. You cannot solve a systemic crisis simply by making it too expensive for a nurse to drive to her night shift, while oil executives continue to reap massive dividends.
Imagine being a Swiss voter in 2021. On your right, oil lobbyists screaming to vote no because climate change is a hoax. On your left, anti-austerity Marxists arguing with equal ferocity to vote no because the bill is an elaborate financial scam.
You're sandwiched between two radically opposed no camps. It illustrates how deeply suspicious these authors are of any policy generated by a capitalist government, even if it has green stamped on it.
Which naturally leads us to examine the political parties that champion these policies. The Green parties themselves.
Yes, we have a trio of articles from Christian Andresev, Hans Gerdefinger, and Florian Keller focusing on the German Green Party.
They track the trajectory of the Greens over 41 years, and we have to remember how they started in 1980.
They were not a polished political machine. They were a grassroots radical coalition born out of anti-nuclear protests, women's liberation, and anti-war sentiment.
Chaining themselves to train tracks, demanding an absolute restructuring of society.
But fast forward 4 decades, the sources describe them as a modern bourgeois liberal party.
They traded combat boots for tailored suits, actively negotiating to form a coalition with Angela Merkel's deeply conservative alliance.
The Marxist analysis here hinges on political co-optation. The argument is that the capitalist parliamentary system is a sophisticated machinery designed to absorb, dilute, and neutralize radical energy.
Because the moment a movement enters the mainstream system, it has to play by the rules of the state.
Exactly. To gain positions, you form coalitions. To form coalitions, you compromise on radical demands. To manage the state, you balance the budget. And how do you balance a capitalist budget?
You enact austerity.
Right. So the party becomes painted in green. They keep the aesthetic branding recycled paper in the office, but their material function becomes managing and protecting the capitalist state.
It's like watching an indie punk band.
Yeah.
They build a rabid following, playing illegal venues, screaming about tearing down the corporate system.
Yeah, and then they get offered a massive contract by the biggest corporate record label.
And the question is, do they change the label from the inside, or does the label change them? Do they smooth out their rough edges and churn out profitable pop songs that just have the vibe of rebellion?
The authors would emphatically argue the latter. Florian Keller's article points to the 2020 stock market crash and the coronavirus pandemic as the ultimate stress test.
When the economy went into freefall, the Greens didn't demand a radical break from capitalism.
No, they prioritized the stability of financial markets. They proved they could be reliable managers of the crisis for the ruling class.
So let's pause and survey the landscape here. Individual consumer action is a distraction. Choices like Paris or diplomatic theater. Carbon pricing is a regressive wealth transfer, and green political parties are completely co-opted.
Right. Every institutional route is viewed as a total dead end.
So,
Yep.
Where do these authors actually see any hope? What is the mechanism for change?
The answer, according to the final synthesis of our sources, lies entirely outside established institutions. It lies in the streets.
Which brings us to the culmination of the deep dive. The global youth climate strikes.
The massive waves of protests sparked by Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future walkouts.
The texts analyze this youth anger directly alongside the incredibly grim realities of the UN's 2014 IPCC report.
Adam Booth's piece on that report is vital. It sets the scientific baseline for their political strategy. The report proved the catastrophic reality.
But the Marxists argue that scientists can't offer the political solution. It's the youth who have correctly identified what needs to happen.
Yes, the teenagers walking out of classrooms aren't asking for adjustments to carbon credit markets. They are explicitly demanding system change.
The International Marxist Tendency Statement from 2019 describes millions of young people from over 100 countries simultaneously walking out. They view this radicalized generation as the engine for true revolutionary change.
There was a placard held by a teenager in London that perfectly distills their thesis. The ocean is rising, and we are too.
A potent phrase. The environmental tipping point is creating a political tipping point. But we need to extrapolate on what this system change actually looks like in material terms.
Right, because revolution isn't just a vague desire for fairness here. It's highly specific.
The demand is the total democratic expropriation of the global monopolies.
Taking the massive resources, technology, logistics networks, and wealth of the billionaire class, legally stripping them of private ownership and placing them under democratic management of the working class.
Removing the profit motive so the global economy can be planned rationally to harmonize with the strict physical limits of the biosphere.
Exactly.
But let me push back hard on this. They argue the fight against climate change and the fight for socialism are synonymous. But practically speaking, how do you bridge the colossal gap between high school students skipping biology class to chance outside City Hall and the total global expropriation of multinational monopolies backed by state militaries?
It's a staggering leap in logic, isn't it?
Yeah. How does skipping school stop ExxonMobil?
It is the defining challenge of their political project. The authors do not believe youth acting alone can overthrow global capitalism. The critical mechanism bridging a school strike to a revolution is the organized labor movement.
The workers.
Exactly. The Marxist theory of power relies entirely on who actually operates the machinery of the economy. The youth strikes serve as a vital spark. They awaken political consciousness.
But they don't have their hands on the levers of production.
Right. The power to halt emissions, the power to bring a conglomerate to its knees, lies solely with the transit workers, factory workers, dock workers, and engineers.
Because if they stop working, capital stops flowing.
Precisely. The Marxist strategy insists the radicalized youth must actively connect their struggle with the broader labor movement. The goal is to evolve a Friday climate strike into a coordinated mass general strike.
Because when the workers who generate the profits decide to stop the machines, the capitalist class loses all power.
That is the only mechanism they believe is capable of forcing a total restructuring of human society.
Wow. Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today.
You really have.
We started by unpacking how these authors completely reject the individual carbon footprint, arguing the true culpability lies with the tiny fraction of humanity who own the global means of production.
We walked through their economic analysis of extreme weather, reframing death tolls in Venice and Germany as the direct, lethal consequences of capitalist austerity.
We examined the brutal reality of the Amazon fires and how the darkening skies over São Paulo acted as a physical catalyst for class consciousness.
We dissected their harsh critiques of mainstream policies, how carbon taxes are regressive wealth transfers, how the Paris Accords are structurally designed to fail, and the concept of green austerity.
We tracked the 41-year history of the German Green Party, exploring the Marxist theory of political co-optation.
And finally, we looked at their defining conclusion, that global youth climate strikes represent hope, provided that energy can be fused with the structural power of the organized working class.
For a total revolutionary expropriation of the global economy. It is a worldview that insists with absolute certainty that tweaking the current system is an ecological impossibility. Capitalism itself, an engine requiring endless growth, is the mechanism of planetary destruction.
And engaging with a framework this fundamentally radical is incredibly valuable. It acts as a new lens.
Exactly. The next time you watch a politician announce a complex new carbon trading scheme or an oil company launch a sustainability ad campaign, you now possess a completely different analytical toolkit to evaluate what is actually happening beneath the PR.
And I will leave you with this final, genuinely provocative thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
If we entertain the absolute foundational premise of these texts, that infinite compounding economic growth is a strict physical impossibility on a planet bound by finite resources, then every environmental debate from this moment forward isn't actually a debate about science or solar panels.
It's a debate about power.
Exactly. It is a brutal, high-stakes debate about who actually gets to own, control, and survive the future.
I think we've covered a lot of ground today, didn't we? I think this is the right point to finish the episode. Thank you for tuning in. Please don't forget to like, share, and comment. You can check the link in the description to listen to the full Deep Dive to Marxism podcast playlist. We're grateful you're here. Take care, comrades. Have a good one.